and you can receive the answer to your question via email. Now we can start with the panel. This is an exciting fireside chat session with the FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, and this will be moderated by Douglas Dimitrov. Mr. Dimitrov is a partner at Phillips Lytle LLP. He has over 20 years of experience in telecommunications matters, representing leading telecommunications carriers, infrastructure providers, and many others. He has a particular expertise in distributed antenna system and other small cell networks, where he is involved with both business and regulatory aspects. Mr. Dimitrov is also a member of the Federal Communications Commission's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, the HETNet Forum, and the Wireless Infrastructure Association. Additionally, he was a co-founder of the New York State Wireless Association, where he served as president for over 5 years and remains an active member of the board of directors. Now, I'd like to hand over to Doug to present our featured speaker. Hello, Doug.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon for those of you who it's afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Melandra. I am thrilled to be here and so thrilled to see Chairman Pai. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Buffalo, virtually.
It's great to be with you virtually. I wish I could be there in person, the city of my birth.
Yeah, I was going to say you have a connection that's interesting. If you want to expand on that, that would be great for those of us who, or for those of the folks that are on that don't know the history.
Sure, yeah, soft spot in my heart for Buffalo. My parents moved to America in 1971, and they started in Buffalo. And I was born in the Sisters of Charity Hospital in 1973. They moved to Canada shortly after that, but my parents still have very fond memories of it. The first football game my dad ever saw was at Rich Stadium with Joe Ferguson and OJ, and it's a place that holds a very special place in the heart of the Pai family.
Well, welcome back, and look forward to having you here in person sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Before we get started with the Q&A and the fireside chat, I just wanted to make a bit of an advertisement, but also to thank you, Chairman Pai. Back in the early stages of pre-pandemic, I should say, the New York State Wireless took something that was part of your vision, frankly through BDAC, which is workforce development issues. And I was lucky enough to be part of the working group on the BDAC that looked into workforce issues. So as we discussed what some of the challenges were, we went back to the New York State Wireless Association and started to think about the importance of promoting the industry for students and for workers that are out there that are looking for something different in terms of a career path. So with your vision and with some funding that we were able to put together, we actually created with the SUNY Impact Foundation, State University of New York, a scholarship program, which we've just rolled out and just successfully awarded the first of 3 scholarships to students across the SUNY system. So thank you, Chairman. The advertisement is for all of the students that are on this session to log on. If you're interested in a scholarship, there are more available. And if you log on to the New York State Wireless Association website, it's nyswa.org, you'll see the link for an application. So for all of those who might be interested, we're delighted, and we're already looking at ways to expand the scholarship in terms of dollars available. So please, applicants, click the link and apply.
Well, if I might, I just have to salute you, Doug, and the New York State Wireless Association. I mean, just the tremendous leadership you've always shown. This initiative is just the latest, but certainly not exclusive. I mean, your leadership on the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee that we had, your founding of the New York State Wireless Association. I mean, I think it'd be very easily just to color within the lines, but you've always been looking at what's coming next and anticipating and being proactive. And it takes people like you to make a positive change in New York State and around the country. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Well, thank you, and it's been an honor to serve on the BDAC and just trying to do our part of the New York State Wireless Association. With that, let's head into some questions and discussions.
Sure.
You've led the FCC during a period of major advancements in telecom technology, and most recently during a period of dramatic change in society's need to stay connected. Um, what are some of the key benefits, from your perspective, seen to date as a result of the FCC's initiatives and actions taken during this period?
I think overall, the bottom line given the reforms we've done over the last 3.5, 4 years, is that we've put in place the building blocks for broadband infrastructure to become much more widely deployed around the country. Whether it is fiber or wireless infrastructure, getting the spectrum out there in the commercial marketplace, we've done a lot to enable private companies to take the initiative, to raise the capital, to hire the work crews, and ultimately build the networks that serve American consumers well. And the pandemic, if anything, has underscored not just the importance of broadband, but the fact that our key reforms that were put in place well before anyone had even heard of COVID-19 were critical to ensuring that our networks would meet the challenge of the times. And that I think they certainly have done in large part.
Absolutely. Big changes and big differences. Streamlining deployment and spectrum policies have really been a great addition to the network infrastructure and capacity. So thank you. What are the current issues that you're focusing on that you think still need to be worked on and advanced?
I think we've certainly done a lot, and we've teed up a lot. So, for example, just this week alone, we adopted at long last an initiative to free up 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band, allowing 160 megahertz wide channel for unlicensed operations. And that's going to be a game changer for fixed wireless companies, especially in parts of upstate New York that are looking to find airwaves for free that they can use to extend connectivity. Still have some infrastructure reforms that we'd like to pursue. As you know, we've been very aggressive in trying to streamline the process so that those who are looking to build the infrastructure of the future don't have to jump through federal and state and local hoops and find exorbitant fees or inordinate delays and that kind of thing. So we're going to continue to look to refine our rules. We still have a lot of work to do when it comes to fiber deployment. And we've done a lot of deregulation, making sure that people have an incentive to focus their investments on fiber as opposed to copper, making sure we get rid of some of the regulations that would inhibit companies from raising capital to lay fiber. And pole attachment reform has been a big thing that we've done as well. The one-touch make-ready reform we pioneered in July of 2019 is a big issue. And so there are a lot of things that we've done, and hopefully the FCC will always focus on making sure that we make the business case for deployment as strong as possible. That's essential in any economy, but especially in parts of the country where that business case might be sketchy given the relatively sparse populations or low incomes. So we need to make sure that ROI is there for the infrastructure to be built.
Right. Thank you. Focusing on New York, you mentioned New York in particular. What do you think the programs are that that can specifically benefit New York in terms of rural, but also the urban areas where there may not be as robust a network infrastructure as one might think?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest was the very first vote that we held when I became chairman, which was a partnership with New York State, essentially matching New York State broadband funds with the FCC's Connect America Fund Phase 2 funding. And that was one way of making sure that we were working in sync to target those parts of New York State that just weren't on the right side of the digital divide. And as you probably know, we're in the middle of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is a $20 billion program. Phase 1 is $16 billion, looking to target unserved parts of the country everywhere that are on the wrong side of the divide. So here too, New York State was really at the vanguard of forward thinking. Additionally, some of the initiatives that we've done, I think are going to tremendously benefit New York State. I mentioned the 5.9 gigahertz band, but in some ways that's small potatoes compared to the 6 gigahertz band, where we freed up 1,200 megahertz, the entire 6 gigahertz band, from 5925 to 7125 megahertz for unlicensed operations. And using that spectrum, you can now get 160, even 320 megahertz wide channels for gigabit Wi-Fi. And that's already proving to be a game changer. 802.11ax gear is being shipped. I think fixed wireless companies are very excited to use it. And in those parts of the New York State where, for whatever reason, you might not be able to lay fiber, this could be a game changer. The other basic bread and butter reforms I think we've initiated are going to be tremendously important to New York State. The quicker and cheaper access to utility poles and things like that are going to be really, really important. So you're very excited about what this will mean for parts of the state that really deserve what I call digital opportunity, but haven't yet had a chance to enjoy it.
Great. Thanks so much. In terms of rural broadband coverage, you mentioned the Rural Opportunity Fund. As you said, also fiber is difficult oftentimes to connect in rural areas. But you've made available spectrum to enhance wireless connections. This is an engineering department at SUNY Buffalo led event. It's called Wireless Day in Buffalo. Do you see a shift in terms of the importance of wireless compared to what it might be today or what it might have been in the past in terms of going forward?
Absolutely. I think there's no question that one of the biggest trend lines over the last 15, 20 years is the world is going wireless. And obviously the iPhone's introduction in 2007 started it, but now I think we're seeing not just incremental improvements with the dawn of 5G, but exponential improvements in some ways. And we're certainly trying to anticipate that by making available a ton of spectrum for 5G. I mentioned, of course, the unlicensed side, which is important, but the complement to that, of course, is the licensed spectrum. And over the last 3.5 years, we've been the most aggressive FCC in history in terms of freeing up commercial spectrum. We've already had 3 auctions of millimeter wave spectrum in the 24, 28, and then 39, 37, 47 gigahertz bands. And that's freed up almost 5,000 megahertz of spectrum for millimeter wave 5G. Yeah, that's more spectrum than was currently held when I took office by all mobile broadband providers combined. Additionally, we've done a lot of work on mid-band spectrum. As you probably know, we've got a 2.5 gigahertz auction that we're looking to hold next year. We finished the 3.5 CBRS auction earlier this year, freeing up essentially 150 megahertz for 5G. And in a couple of weeks, December 8th, we're going to be starting the C-band auction at 280 megahertz swath of spectrum from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. That's going to be a game changer for 5G with big channels and strong capacity, good coverage. So I think 5G, we're only at maybe the first or second inning, to use a baseball analogy, but the FCC is putting in place all kinds of building blocks that the private sector can use. And there's no telling what the use cases are going to be. I mean, I think most people, when they hear wireless, they go just scrolling through pictures on my phone or surfing YouTube. But the use cases for 5G, I think, are going to be transformative, both on the consumer and the enterprise side. We might see the enterprise side take off earlier, but the consumer side, it could be AR, VR, it could be people at a Buffalo Bills game watching, in real time something on their phone. It's going to be amazing, and I can't wait to see it transpire.
Great. Let's shift to fiber. On the fiber side, we have a question from one of the registrants asked in advance of the session today. What role is public and private sectors working together for broadband deployment in fiber in particular? What's your answer to that?
That's a good question. So there are 2 different parts of the answer from our perspective, at least. Number one is the overwhelming amount of investment in broadband infrastructure comes from the private sector. We don't have unlimited funds. And so it follows from that we need to make the business case for deploying fiber as easy as possible. And that's part of the reason why in 2017, we ended utility cell regulation of the internet, why in 2018, we pursued the Connect America Fund Phase 2 model that encouraged fiber deployment. Why in 2019, we pursued the One Touch Make Ready reform that I mentioned a little bit earlier, where now competitive fiber providers can do all of the work on the utility poles themselves in terms of moving the electric utility attachment and the cable incumbent attachment. They don't have to go and beg for permission and wait and pay fees. So those kinds of things are very, very important for the FCC to do in order to allow you to build the fiber infrastructure in the future. But in addition to that, there is that universal service fund that we oversee, essentially an $8 to $10 billion annual CapEx fund. And there too, we've tried to encourage the deployment of fiber. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is a good example of that. Even though the FCC's definition of broadband is 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits per second up, we recognize that the future is going to feature increasing demands on the networks. And so we want to put a thumb on the scale in favor of faster speeds, in particular things like gigabit fiber. And so now in the RDOF, as it is known, if you are bidding at the gigabit fiber tier, for example, and you're competing against someone who's only bidding to serve at 25 megabits per second, you get a significant bump. In fact, if the budget for the auction is cleared, then actually the gigabit fiber bid would necessarily win over the 25 megabits per second service. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to do to incentivize the deployment of fiber, because we realize it's such a resilient technology, and I would argue it's an unsung hero of the 5G revolution to come. we're always thinking about spectrum, of course, and the wireless infrastructure, but if we don't have fiber to backhaul all of the traffic from those billions of connected devices, that's a real bottleneck. So we recognize that fiber is really important, and we've been focused on it quite a bit over the last couple of years.
Well, one of the things I've appreciated, Chairman Pai, is the your aggressiveness and really trying to stretch things and push the envelope in a number of ways. And you've described 5G as being a race, a global race for 5G and deployment and applying 5G to use cases that are helpful to people and helpful to business. Can you give us some sense as to where you think we're doing? How are we doing in that race, and where we may go, or how things may evolve over the next several years?
Fantastic question. I think we're doing exceptionally well. And I've been inspired by the leadership that we showed in 4G. When I came into office in 2012, the United States had something like 4% of the U.S.'s of the world population, but 50% of the world's LTE connections. And that's the kind of leadership we want to show in 5G. And that's why we've been so aggressive over the last 4 years in making spectrum available for the commercial marketplace, in pursuing wireless infrastructure reforms, in encouraging the deployment of fiber. Those three things form the 5G Fast Plan, which I introduced a couple of years ago. And folks who are interested can go to fcc.gov/5G to get more information. But I think the spectrum site is a good exemplar of how we've been aggressive. On every single one of these bands, we're not talking about greenfield spectrum. There's always going to be an incumbent or somebody who wants to use it for something else. And so the typical FCC approach was, well, let's just try to find consensus, and if anyone objects, then we won't move ahead. But that's not good enough for me, because at the end of the day, we need to put points on the board in terms of 5G. Otherwise, capital and talent and ultimately deployment will go to other countries, other regions of the world. And so, yeah, we've had to battle other federal agencies in some cases. We've had to resist the calls from some of the incumbents who aren't necessarily using spectrum that they've been given a couple decades ago. But the end result is a powerful motivator for the private sector to take what we've done and run with it. And that's exactly what we're going to do when it comes to 5G. So I think we're doing quite well. Objectively speaking, in terms of low-band spectrum, we now have carriers using 600 megahertz spectrum to cover 250 million Americans with 5G service. In mid-band, we're on track to have a 530 megahertz wide swath from 3.45 to essentially 4.0 gigahertz available for 5G. And millimeter wave, and as I said, we've freed up a total of 5 gigahertz of spectrum. On the wireless infrastructure side, 87,000 cell sites deployed over the last 3 years, more than from 2013 to 2016 combined. And that in the last year alone was 46,000 cell sites. So I think some of the reforms we've adopted there are really going to take shape in the years to come. And fiber deployment, I mean, we set a record in 2018, a record that we only broke in 2019. So all the indicators, the objective indicators are good. And I think it's going to require the private sector to continue to take the risk and raise that capital, hire the work crews, and build the 5G future here in America, which I'm confident they'll do.
Thanks. Those are great trends, great statistics. Shifting a little bit, again, question from one of the registrants in advance of the session today. The FCC has been very focused and so far successful in prying open access to public rights-of-way infrastructure. What can be done in the future to further open access to in-building multiple dwelling units, multiple tenant environments for fixed wireless or competitive wireline broadband companies?
That is a fantastic question. And, I actually worked on this issue almost a dozen years ago when I was a lawyer at the FCC, and I encountered an issue where some of the multiple dwelling units were making deals with the incumbents and essentially saying, you can't even give access to any competitive fiber provider, fixed wireless provider, whatever it is. And I was proud to work on the legal team that helped shepherd through one of the first orders from the FCC. But when I got this job, I thought there's still some barriers that I'm hearing about that need to be broken down. And that's why in 2017 and 2018, we started what we call the Multi-Tenant Environment, or MTE, or MDU if you prefer, initiative, essentially looking at what are some of the barriers that some of the competitive companies are facing when they're looking to provide service. And here too, we have an ongoing proceeding to look at what specific proposals can the FCC adopt to break down some of those barriers. And the good news is that I think a lot of people still very much want to have a competitive option. One of the companies, for example, that provides service in New York State called Starry, fixed wireless company, and because their service is so good and the price point is appealing and the word of mouth is spreading, there are actually people who are clamoring, badgering their own multiple dwelling unit owners. Hey, look, I want to have the freedom to and use my own provider. I really like this company, and they're starting to take share in some of these MDUs. And so I hope that a combination of FCC attention to this issue and market forces, sort of the aggregated decisions of consumers saying we want a competitive option, those two forces will be powerful ones, encouraging more competition in the MDU space. That's a huge issue in the future, especially as many more people are going to be working from home in these apartment buildings in the future.
Right. Is there a state role in relief, if you will, on regulatory issues around MTE? You have a sense for that?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on state law, New York State or any other state laws. It might depend, of course, on a particular state, but generally speaking, every state tends to have competition laws. And so if you see an example of anti-competitive conduct, that's the kind of thing that any state, I would think, would be empowered and motivated to address. Additionally, I think that there are a lot of things that states can do to work with the FCC. And so, the sharing of information is very, very important. If a state sees certain consumer complaints, for example, involving, hey, this MDU is just shutting out any kind of service option whatsoever, that's the kind of thing that they can share with us, and then we can at least incorporate it into our decision making. So, if there's something on the New York State level that can be done, great. And if they want to share information with us, we would always have an open door and an open mind to hearing that information.
Yeah, we'll look at that from the New York State Wireless perspective, and we may be back to your team on that. Shifting to another question, how can academics contribute to the FCC's work to facilitate data-driven policymaking and other related policies?
Fantastic question. So this is something that I've actually thought about a lot too. When I was a commissioner previously, I always wondered, why are the data analytics folks, the economists, the big thinkers kind of sprinkled throughout the agency? It didn't really make any sense. They never had a seat at the policy-making table. So one of the initiatives I announced in 2017, and we actually made it happen in 2018, was the creation of the Office of Economics and Analytics, giving a centralized home to the data analysts that we have who are great, and you work with those on the outside to drive more data-driven decision-making. And so one of the things I specifically highlighted in my 2018 speech and announcing this initiative, and that's come to pass, is the development of white papers, sort of the big think academic papers that would help the FCC look at policies that might seem crazy now, but will drive significant value in the future. Historically, that's been the source of a lot of the FCC's best work. Price cap regulation in the 80s, for example. The broadcast incentive auction we held was a child of some white papers in the early 2000s. And I'm hopeful that academics can work with our Office of Economics and Analytics to come up with those wild and crazy ideas for the future. For example, 5G adjacent technologies. How should we think about 5G and artificial intelligence and machine learning? What is the role of quantum computing in the communication space in the future? Is there anything that is relevant in the blockchain space? When you're thinking about the FCC's allocation of spectrum, could it be that a distributed ledger type technology might help us better manage how spectrum is allocated in what time and what place? I mean, those are the kinds of things that people who are far smarter than me would be able to contribute on. And moreover, just generally speaking, the data-driven analysis that we do in our bread and butter work is stuff like cost-benefit analysis. There, we're always eager for information. You'd be surprised how often we come up with a policy proposal, and it seems intuitively that the benefits would outweigh the costs. But when we put it out for public input, for public comment, sometimes we don't get as much granular information as we would like. And this is where I think data analysts and economists could really give us a big boost. If there's an academic specializing in one particular area, let us know, help us quantify how the cost-benefit analysis plays out, because that can really help buttress, or if it's a bad proposal, torpedo some of the bad ideas before they materialize. So there's a big role for academics at the FCC, in my view, and we welcome all kinds of input, especially on the engineering side.
Terrific. Great news for those on the faculty and of SUNY Buffalo and other faculties, I'm sure.
And one other thing, if I might flag too, sorry to interrupt, but I know we were talking about data-driven decision making, but the other thing is on the spectrum side too. One of the things we're always trying to sift through, and I mentioned all these spectrum battles we've had, is some of the very, very delicate technical questions about interference, or what would happen if we freed up this amount of spectrum, or can we share the spectrum and using what protocols? That's the kind of thing that we would love to have academic input on as well on the engineering side.
Terrific. A call to action, folks.
Yeah.
For students, Chairman Pai, and any messages for them, or things that they might consider from your perspective in terms of telecom opportunities?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, I know I'm biased, but I think the telecom field is just fascinating and only getting more so. And I would say that all of you should dive in right into the deep end and find what it is that motivates you. The telecom space is no longer just Ma Bell, 3 broadcast companies, and your daily newspaper. I mean, now we're talking about non-geostationary satellite orbit constellations launching into low Earth orbit. What should the rules for that be? What spectrum should they use? What should the orbital debris rules be? How do we encourage launch here in the United States? And all those kinds of questions. On the terrestrial side too, I mean, so many spectrum bands being teed up. When I got into this field in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was thought that spectrum above 2 gigahertz was unusable for wireless. I mean, now we're talking about terahertz above. We have an initiative on above 95 gigahertz spectrum for licensed and unlicensed use. So many green paths for you to plow there. And the other thing I would advise you to do is just talk to people who are in the field, either on the public or private side, and figure out what makes them tick. What work are they doing? Is there any way you can assist? Don't just be content to study and then passively do your work in university. Really try to engage and do internships, especially now during the pandemic. It's a golden opportunity to do virtual internships with government agencies or companies and the like. Read as much as you can from people who are smart, and then call them up and see, hey, look, I'd love to have coffee with you, or share a Zoom call or whatever. And those are the kinds of things that will ultimately pay off. They might seem incremental, if that, in the short run, but those are the people who are going to remember, yes, such and such student pinged me about this. He or she showed an interest. Let me see, I heard about this job that opened up in the field. Let me talk to her. And that's the kind of thing that can really build a career over time. So don't be shy, be courageous, be bold, and don't be content with the status quo.
Are there internship opportunities for undergraduates at the FCC?
Funny you should mention that. There are indeed. So one of the things I just announced earlier this year, as a matter of fact, is not just the fact of those internships, but also my recognition that in many cases, people are just not able to work at the FCC in an internship capacity if they don't have funding. I mean, it's impossible to do some of these internships for free. So we're starting an initiative soon to give stipends to undergraduates, to graduate students, law students, and the like, to support their interning at the FCC. And so that's something we very much welcome. And especially if you're an engineering student or someone with a technical background, our Office of Engineering and Technology, our Office of Economics and Analytics, and others would love to have the benefit of your wisdom. We will welcome wisdom from whatever quarter we can find it. And so any great students at Buffalo or throughout New York State, definitely look us up. We're doing some pretty cool stuff, and the water's warm.
That's fantastic news. A couple of other questions from registrants. If the results of the election hold, do you believe a new administration will try to reverse some of the deregulatory actions that you took as chairman?
That's a good question. Obviously, whenever there's a change of administration, there tends to be a change in some certain big picture policies. And, of course, net neutrality being one of the hottest topics, I would imagine that's going to generate some attention. But I would argue that the bigger picture things that we have done don't know a partisan affiliation. I mean, leading the world in 5G, for example, it's not a Republican issue or Democratic issue. That's just an American issue. The broadband initiatives we've started to close the digital divide. I mean, there too, no partisan affiliation. Some of the things that many people might not think about, but the FCC has actually pioneered, are very, very important regardless of what party you belong to. Establishing 988 as a 3-digit number for suicide prevention and mental health, cracking down on the ridiculous rates that those who are incarcerated pay to communicate with their loved ones on the outside, making sure that those who are disabled have access to technologies in the same way that those of us who aren't disabled might. And these are the kinds of things we've done that I understand don't generate a lot of press attention, but nonetheless exhibit our commitment to the public interest. And that is a commitment that I believe firmly spans administrations and parties.
In terms of the maybe I mean, how do I put this? It, some have raised concerns about what they refer to as digital redlining in various communities. What has the commission done, and what more do you think the commission can do to address situations like that?
That's a really good question. And that's why when I was a commissioner, one of the things I proposed was what I called gigabit opportunity zones. Essentially, you could take an area that is as small as an urban city block or as large as a rural county, so long as the median income in that area was 75% or less of the national median, then the government would extend tax breaks to companies to build broadband infrastructure in those areas. For whatever reason, we've noticed this phenomenon too, that certain parts of a city just might not seem to present the return on investment for companies sufficient to warrant them building that infrastructure. So our goal is to change that equation, to build a stronger business case for deployment. Additionally, some of the reforms I've just talked about really do make a big difference. For example, it was actually urban broadband providers that strongly encouraged us to do the one-touch make-ready reform. There was a company called Rocket Fiber in Detroit, Michigan, for instance. And one of the things they told me was that it was almost impossible for them to get timely, cheap access to either the utility poles or to the conduit under the ground because they faced all of these objections from the cable incumbent or the electric utility. Now, because of One Touch Make Ready, they can do that work much more quickly and target parts of Detroit that no provider has ever wanted to serve. And I've actually visited one of those neighborhoods in Detroit, and it makes a big difference. And so those are the kinds of reforms that we'd like to see. Going forward, what I'd love to see as well is for Congress to give the FCC authority over utility poles that are owned by municipalities and by railroads. I know it sounds kind of random, but we only have jurisdiction over poles that are owned by utilities. And so to the extent that a city says, you know what, we've got a sweet deal with the incumbent, we're not going to allow any competitive access to any competing broadband provider, that means that entire neighborhoods essentially don't have much option. And so we want to open the doors to them having access to the utility poles. And I know here too, it's my wife's eyes glaze over when I talk about pole attachments, but that can be one of the biggest cost elements to building a broadband network. And so our goal is to make it as easy as possible and as fast as possible for those who are struggling in densely populated urban areas to get the digital opportunity they deserve.
During the initial phase of BDAC, the first 2 years of BDAC, of course, we looked at the One Touch Make Ready issues, and I'm curious, Chairman Pai, what's your take on whether the extent to which the utilities are now more coordinated and working better with telecom providers?
So we're collecting data on a macro level about how it's going, but certainly on an anecdotal basis, the early results are very, very good. I mean, I've talked to a number of fiber providers across the country, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Pacific Northwest, who have said that it is significantly easier now to do the necessary legwork. And now they actually have the regulatory certainty they need to amp up their fiber deployment. And on the utility side, of course, there's a lot of complaining about the fact that we reformed these rules. But now that we have, and the sky hasn't fallen, and all these objections have not proven to be valid, I think they've come to realize that they have something to gain too. And what's interesting is that part of the reason is that we've encouraged them themselves to enter the broadband business. So through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and through some of our other reforms, electric utilities are now able to compete as well for funding from the FCC. So oddly enough, one of the entities that traditionally has objected to some of our reforms to make it easier to deploy broadband is now on the other side, working to develop broadband with us. And so I think that they've recognized too that we're all in it together, that it's not worth fighting over the parochial turf that we might have fought over in the past. So oddly enough, I get the sense that things are getting a little better. Although I know that in certain places, including New York State, I've heard of some problems still as well. But I think parenthood in many ways is a good training for handling pole attachment policy. You've just got to persuade everybody to work together in a sandbox. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, it strikes me, maybe that's another element of convergence, and that is, the energy, utility industry, and telecom. It's an interesting point you made about, the electric utility, now maybe competing in the telecom industry. And New York is a leader on energy policy in many ways, and maybe that's another sort of policy issue, a policy approach to take if there's certain energy policies that can dovetail with the telecom policy, maybe that's an approach that should be considered.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the 900 megahertz band is a great example of that. So we just passed this earlier this year, essentially allowing private LTE networks to use a small slice of the 900 megahertz band. And this is primarily going to be used by electric utilities. One of the things that I was pitching to them, and they finally, they saw the light, pardon the pun, was that they are able to create these private LTE networks that would allow any electric utility to set up essentially its own management system, its wireless management system for its plant. So it can do security monitoring. It can do real-time data monitoring of how electricity is being distributed through the network. And that's the kind of thing that they see as a game changer for them. You move from the slow-moving analog power grid of the past to a very digital, agile network of the future. So that, here too, my message to the electric folks has always been, look, we don't view you as an enemy. We're all in it together. Whether it's giving you spectrum in the 900 megahertz band to use for private LTE, encouraging you to participate in the broadband deployment programs we've got, you have a seat at the table too. So, let's all get together and make this a better broadband economy for all Americans.
Makes complete sense to me. One of the questions you've referred to, use cases and how things are evolving. Do you have a sense for timing and when we're going to see actual deployment or application use cases actually being applied and used in the marketplace? And I understand there's still evolution of the 5G standards that it's going to take a little bit more time. Do you have a sense for those two pieces? How long until the standards are truly or maybe more fully developed? And then when would we actually see in the marketplace some of these really cool use cases?
So as to the technical standards questions, I mean, I know that things are still in flux. In fact, the folks on the call probably know better than me, but I think some of those technical standards, for example, a 5G NRU, the 5G specification for the use of the 6 gigahertz band, is very much underway. And hopefully that's going to be wrapped up in short order if it hasn't already. But those are the kinds of things that once hammered out, I think are really going to allow 5G to pop. And we're already seeing some 5G service being deployed. I mentioned the 600 megahertz band, which one company, T-Mobile, is currently using to serve up to 250 million Americans, or at least 250 million Americans have the ability to get 5G service. Other providers as well, Verizon, AT&T, even some of the smaller ones, are starting to offer 5G service as well. Apple's debut of the iPhone 12, I think, is really a Kickstarter on the device side. So now you start to see consumer smartphones. They're going to be incorporating 5G ability, and that's going to be a big thing too. But I actually think that 5G is going to be really transformative on some of the other devices that most people might not be thinking about. If everything from gaming consoles to cars, refrigerators, to wireless IoT sensors that we carry around on us as patients, so that our healthcare providers can remotely monitor us. I mean, those are the types of things where we are seeing a tremendous amount of innovation. And I would say in the next year, certainly the next 2 years, that type of stuff is really going to take off. We've only scratched the surface. And, I think now innovators have the certainty they need because we've put in place the spectrum and the infrastructure policies they can count on, that it's really going to take off. And I, as a consumer and as a regulator, I just can't wait to see where it goes. It's a really exciting future ahead.
Yeah, it certainly is. Can you talk a little about the telehealth programs that your commission has led and they're available?
This is something I believe in so strongly. I grew up as a child of two physicians, and after Buffalo, we moved to rural Kansas, where they would drive. Sometimes my dad would drive sometimes 45 minutes in the morning to another even smaller town than the one we lived in, and the next day he might drive to a separate one an hour north. And that's because it was really hard to find physicians willing to work in these small communities. And much to my parents' chagrin, I didn't go to medical school. I'm still living down that omission. But now what I can do at least is to boost the power of telehealth, which I would argue is one of the tips of the spear when it comes to broadband's power to improve the lives of Americans. And we have had a rural healthcare program that was set up in 1997, where the FCC essentially gave a discount to healthcare providers at the healthcare facilities, the hospitals, on the connectivity needs that they had. That budget was static at $400 million from 1997 all the way until 2018. But what I said was, look, this program is, if anything, telehealth is going to be increasing in demand in the future. So we actually increased that budget for the first time ever to $571 million. And now it's indexed for inflation. So the current year is something like 620 or 640 million. And so that is the rural healthcare program, which is important But when the pandemic hit and it was clear in February and March that we would be moving to a stay-at-home environment, I went to Congress and I said, you've got to give us emergency authority and funding to set up a new telehealth program. Nothing against our rural healthcare program, but number one, it's focused on rural areas. And number two, it's got a whole bunch of rules that we have to apply. We need something more flexible, more agile, faster to be able to get the job done. And Congress did that in the CARES Act. They allowed us to adopt the COVID-19 telehealth program. They gave us $200 million to do it. And within a matter of days, we stood up this program. And so we've now allocated all $200 million to 539 healthcare facilities around the country, from New York City to Navajo Nation. And we're starting to get stories back about how they're using that funding for powerful telehealth applications. The University of Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, for example, has a child transplant unit that is giving telehealth solutions to infant patients who are immunocompromised, so they don't have to come back into the facility to be monitored periodically after the transplant surgery. Mental health consultations, with obviously the social isolation and other mental health stresses caused by the pandemic, mental health consultations are in high demand, and we've seen significant improvements in the mental health of patients from those entities that have gotten COVID-19 telehealth program funding, because they're able to reach out proactively and say, hey, are you doing okay? Are you taking your medications? And that sort of thing. So I'm hopeful that this is proof of concept and that Congress gives us additional funding and authority, but also just breaks down all of the legacy telehealth restrictions that have held it back, well beyond the FCC's bailiwick. Interstate medical licensure, for example, making sure that reimbursement is the norm rather than the exception. These are the kinds of things that could leverage the power of broadband to improve the health of everybody around the country.
Fantastic. A question came in regarding the public safety and deployment and use cases and the FirstNet program that's been implemented and being built out and deployed. What's your take and maybe on how that's evolving, and what really is the outlook for enhanced public safety?
A good question. So FirstNet, the FCC's job technically has been done for a while. We've granted them the license. We've certified their technical plans. So now the Department of Commerce is overseeing that effort. But my understanding is that it's going relatively well. But we're not content with that. We've actually been extremely aggressive on public safety. Just give you a couple of examples. Wireless location accuracy. So one of the things that is tough if you're calling from a wireless phone and you're calling 911, how do first responders find you? And over the last couple of years, we've enhanced the precision with which first responders get information. So now, if you're calling from a multi-story building, for example, we now have a Z-axis metric that requires the wireless provider to convey the exact vertical location within one floor, so that 911 responders, you don't show up to a 50-story building and wonder, okay, we know it's at this address, but where exactly is it? The same thing with multi-line telephone systems. We've gotten rid of the need for an access code, a 9 or an 8, to be dialed before dialing 911. And we've also ensured that when you're calling from a multi-line telephone system within an office building or apartment or whatever, that we aren't using a PBX location that could be in Canada if you're in Buffalo, for example. So it's targeted to the precise building that you're calling from. A few other public safety things we've done in the wake of Hurricane Maria and Irma, some of the natural disasters we've seen, we've stood up the ability to quickly restore communications. Partly, oddly enough, this goes back to our earlier conversation about coordinating with the power industry. One of the things I found, for example, in the wake of Hurricane Michael, when I visited Mexico City, Florida, was that the power companies, their sole interest at the time was naturally in getting the power up and running again. So what they would do is when they found the lines that were downed on the ground, they would just cut them, even though it might be a fiber line that was being cut that didn't have any problems with it. And they weren't talking to the telecom companies, and the telecom companies too. They would do the same. They would just not coordinate with the power companies. So we set up a coordination system now so that in the public safety realm, when things are really emergent, you don't have power and telecom working at opposite sides. And they're also liaising with the government too. We have a very strong working relationship now with FEMA and with state public safety offices, so that the minute something happens in New York State or Puerto Rico or wherever, we have a one-stop shop. We have the phone numbers, we've got email addresses, we're all on the same page. And so that basic coordination, I think, is something that is a major big game changer for public safety going forward.
Dr. Melandra, I want to open it up to you if you have any last questions. I have one final question. I know we're getting close to the end of the time period. Is there anything that you or your team would like to ask before I ask one wrap-up question?
just one question. Thank you very much, Mr. Pai. A question from the audience, actually, from a presenter. So
Sure.
they highlighted it would be important to have a common North American infrastructure to foster economic exchange. How deep is the exchange between the FCC and Industry Canada on 5G North American issues?
Oh, very strong. In fact, my friends at both Industry Canada and CRTC, the Canadian Radio Communications Corporation, we get along Commission. We get along very, very well. We work together on a bunch of cross-border issues, not so much in terms of a joint infrastructure, which I understood was the gist of the question, but on spectrum coordination issues, for example, in the context of the incentive auction, we had to coordinate to make sure that Canadian television broadcasters weren't operating at full power along the border when someone in Buffalo might be using that same frequency for wireless. So on things like that, we're very much on the same page. Robocalls as well. We've got an initiative working with the Canadian government to make sure that the shake and stir framework, which is essentially a digital authentication for all telephone calls, to ensure that those who are spoofing a number don't continue to do that. So the very first cross-border authenticated call was held between me and my counterpart in Canada. So on a bunch of different issues, we coordinate. If there's something on the infrastructure side we could be doing, let us know. We would be happy to do that. But thus far, I'm not aware of any particular initiative along those lines.
Okay, thank you. Doug, you had a final question?
Yes, one final question, Chairman Pai. 10 years from now, if people were to discuss your legacy at the FCC, what do you think, or what would you like them to think and say?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I would say, or I would like to have it be said, he didn't just talk about it, he did it. That a lot of people have talked about being bold in spectrum policy for a long time. This FCC actually moved the ball forward in a significant way. Against significant opposition on many of these different spectrum bands, leading the world in terms of freeing up spectrum for the commercial marketplace. On infrastructure, we didn't just talk about it, we did it. We broke down some of the state and local barriers to wireless infrastructure deployment, and that's allowed small cells and other wireless infrastructure to take off. On fiber deployment, we didn't just talk about it, we did it. We got rid of utility-style regulation of the internet. We encouraged companies to move their investments from copper to fiber. We've looked at technologies of the future in terms of fiber deployment. Same thing when it comes to emerging technologies. Here too, we didn't just talk about it, we actually did it. Encouraging non-geostationary satellite orbited constellations to launch for the first time ever, giving them more spectrum to do so. Encouraging fixed wireless companies to enter the marketplace. We've talked a lot, we've held a forum on artificial intelligence and machine learning, open radio access networks, and some of those adjacent technologies that will allow America to lead. So I think the mark that we've left now, and hopefully in a decade's time, will be one of action that delivered tremendous value to American consumers, regardless of where they might happen to live. And that plus perhaps a big mug that I happen to carry around might be something that people will remember in the time to come.
Cheers to the mug. Well, thank you so much, Chairman Pai, for your leadership, your vision. It's been terrific, and for especially sharing with us today your invaluable time. It's been my pleasure, and thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Grazie to our host and to everyone in Buffalo.
Prego.
If you ever have a question, feel free to, you can always shoot me an email at ajit.pai@fcc.gov. Really appreciate the chance to share thoughts with you, and I hope to make it up to Buffalo one of these days, and maybe we can all get some wings at the Anchor Bar.
We would be glad to have you in Buffalo.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much. And also, we will be sending some of the questions that there was no time to take, maybe via email, if you yourself have time. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it. Take care. See you later.
Yep.
Have a great day.
So thank you again to Mr. Pai for this insightful and exciting fireside chat session. And thanks a lot, Doug, also for handling the session so professionally. So I can go back to the presentation.